They say some winters carve themselves into a nation's memory like ice into stone, and the winter of 1955 was one of them. It descended without mercy, sweeping over Britain like a curtain of white silence. Streets froze, rooftops glittered under a pale sun that gave no warmth, and towns that had survived war now faced a new enemy, an unforgiving cold that crept through doors, windows, and every breath. This was Britain locked beneath an iron sky, where even hope seemed to shiver. Picture stepping outside before sunrise and feeling the air sting your skin like needles. Picture trains frozen in their tracks, fires struggling to stay lit, and families learning to survive with what little they had. If you love stories like these, raw, real, and buried in time, subscribe to Britain Rewind so you never miss another deep dive into Britain's past. And tell me in the comments, have you ever heard your parents or grandparents speak about winters like this? Because this is the winter that froze Britain solid. The winter of 1955 stands out because it arrived during a turning point in British life. The country was transitioning from post-war austerity into a new era filled with hopes of technological progress, social change, and economic recovery. Families were buying their first televisions. Busy factories powered Britain's comeback. Streets that once echoed with air raid sirens now carried the noise of rebuilding and renewal. And then came the cold. Meteorologists of the time were stunned by the suddenness of it. Reports of brutally low temperatures, -10, -12, in some rural areas even lower, spread across newspapers. Britain had endured harsh winters before, but the winter of 1955 seemed determined to test the strengths and weaknesses of every corner of the country. It disrupted transport, industry, agriculture, and daily life. It pushed emergency services to the brink, and it forced millions of people to rediscover old survival habits their parents and grandparents once relied on. Its significance lies not only in the weather itself, but in the timing. Britain was not expecting a crisis. Yet that winter reminded an entire generation that nature could still bring the nation to its knees. The story begins in late December 1954. The Christmas celebrations had been unusually mild. Families walked through city streets without scarves. Some regions had rainfall instead of frost. Many believed the winter might pass with barely a flurry of snow. Then, in the first week of January 1955, the weather changed mood. A cold front descended from the Arctic, sweeping across Scotland first, then racing down into northern England, Wales, and eventually the south. In Aberdeen, the first warnings went up, temperatures dropping fast, dangerous wind chill, roads beginning to freeze. By January 4th, large parts of the Highlands were coated in snow so thick that farmers struggled to reach their animals. By January 6th, the cold wave reached the industrial north. Coal yards froze solid. Machinery jammed. Pipes burst. Entire rail lines were blocked by ice. Cities like Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham found themselves wrapped in a bitter chill that shocked commuters and halted transport in every direction. On January 10th, the south of England finally fell under the same spell. Snow blanketed London overnight. When residents woke, the city felt transformed, white, silent, eerie. The Thames carried sheets of ice along its surface. Bridges groaned under the freeze. And for the first time in years, the capital slowed to a crawl. The cold deepened for the next 2 weeks. Roads became treacherous. Schools struggled to stay open. Hospitals overflowed with cases of flu, frostbite, and hypothermia. And even as the nation tried to adapt, another challenge emerged: fuel shortages. Coal, the heat source for most homes, was difficult to transport because lorries slid off icy roads or simply couldn't start in the frigid mornings. Some families went days with barely a flicker of warmth. By late January, Britain felt like a country stuck in suspended animation. The winter had not just arrived. It had taken command. To understand how brutally cold it was, imagine this: milk bottles left on doorsteps cracked open as the liquid inside expanded into solid ice. Curtains stiffened with frost. Inside bedrooms, children could see their breath drifting like smoke in the early morning dimness. Icicles hung from gutters like glass daggers, sometimes 2 or 3 feet long. On the streets, the smell of coal smoke mixed with the crisp scent of frozen air. You could hear the distant clatter of snow chains on lorry tires. Footsteps echoed louder than usual because the snow muffled everything except the crunch of boots. In the countryside, farms transformed into white deserts. Sheep huddled behind stone walls, their wool coated with frost. Barn doors froze shut. Water troughs became solid blocks, forcing farmers to smash them open with hammers just to keep their animals alive. Even the sea felt the wrath of the freeze. Ports along the east coast watched patches of ice drift in cold grey water. Fishing boats were trapped in harbors, unable to break free from the frozen layers forming around them. And everywhere, the days felt short, the nights long, and the silence overwhelming. But behind every weather report and temperature reading were the people, the ones who actually endured the winter day by day. In small villages, neighbors checked on each other daily. Children delivered hot soup to elderly residents whose fires had gone out. Families gathered around a single coal stove, sharing blankets and telling stories to pass the time. In towns, shopkeepers stayed open late to provide essentials, even if they had to scrape ice off their windows every hour. Milkmen marched through snowdrifts that reached their knees just to complete their deliveries. Postmen slipped along frozen paths, careful not to drop letters or parcels. In the cities, the resilience was just as visible. Railway workers hammered solid sheets of ice from tracks. Doctors trudged on foot to visit patients they couldn't reach by car. Firefighters battled not only flames but frozen hydrants that refused to release water. And throughout the country, mothers and fathers rationed what little fuel they had, prioritizing children's bedrooms while they themselves slept under piles of blankets. The winter of 1955 wasn't defined by the cold alone. It was defined by how people responded to it. By the middle of January, the crisis deepened. Transport systems were collapsing. Train wheels froze to rails. Coal trucks got stuck on icy slopes. At one point, some northern towns had only a day's worth of fuel left. Rumors of potential blackouts spread. Newspapers published warnings about frostbite and hypothermia. Hospitals pleaded for blood donations as injuries from falls skyrocketed. For farmers, the danger was even more personal. In some areas, entire flocks were buried beneath blizzards so fierce that shepherds couldn't reach the hillsides. Tractors failed. Food supplies dwindled. And many families feared they might lose their livestock altogether, a devastating blow to their livelihoods. In industrial areas, the cold threatened production lines that powered the nation's economy. Factories slowed. Workers were sent home. Steel mills struggled to maintain heat in their furnaces. Every hour of lost production put strain on a nation still recovering from wartime shortages. And then came the rail crisis. Dense ice formed on overhead lines, disabling electric trains. Snowdrifts blocked platforms. Commuters waited for hours, shivering on platforms illuminated by dim lamps. Even the London Underground felt the effects, Condensation inside tunnels froze, forming sheets of ice along the tracks. Every day seemed to push Britain a little closer to paralysis. People wondered how much longer the country could withstand the pressure. But like every winter, even this one had to give way eventually. In the first week of February, the weather finally began to soften. The bitter winds relaxed. Days grew slightly longer. Temperatures crept above freezing, first in the south, then slowly across the north. The thaw was messy, roads flooded, rooftops dripped constantly, and slush-coated pavements, but it was a relief that washed across the country like a breath of warm air. Communities celebrated in small ways. Children made snowmen out of the melting piles. Farmers rushed to free their livestock from the last trapped fields. Railway workers repaired tracks with renewed energy. And families, after weeks of struggle, sat close to the fire not because they were fighting for warmth, but because they were finally allowed a moment of peace. Looking back, the winter of 1955 taught the country something important. It reminded people of their vulnerability, but also their strength. It showed how, even in a world moving rapidly toward modernization, nature could still dictate the pace of life. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed how deeply Britain's spirit of community ran. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers shared supplies. Families endured hardship together. The winter that froze Britain solid also warmed Britain's sense of unity. Now it's your turn. Have you ever heard stories from parents or grandparents about the winter of 1955 or any other brutal British winter they lived through? What memories or local legends were passed down in your family? Share them in the comments below, and let's keep these pieces of history alive.